The sun pushed through the lace curtains of the old house, not with a cheerful brightness, but with a dusty, sleepy light. It fell in squares on the worn carpet, illuminating the tiny galaxies of dust that danced in the still air. The house was holding its breath. It was Tuesday, and in this house, Tuesday was a day for waiting. The air itself felt thick, heavy with all the words that weren't being said. In the small study off the main hallway, the older son sat at a heavy oak desk. He was a man in his 40s, but the weight on his shoulders seemed to add a decade to his posture. His movements were slow, precise, and full of purpose. He was sorting through a lifetime of paper. Stacks of old bills, insurance policies, yellowed photographs, and faded greeting cards were being separated into neat piles: keep, shred, and for mother. This act of organizing was his shield. If he could create order out of this chaotic mess of memories, maybe he could bring some order to the chaos in his heart. He picked up a faded photograph of his mother, young and vibrant, laughing on a beach somewhere he couldn't remember. Her smile was so wide, so full of life, it felt like a punch to the gut. He quickly placed it face down in the keep pile, as if the image itself was too painful to look at for more than a second. He wasn't just sorting papers. He was trying to file away his grief, to contain it in neat, manageable boxes. But grief, he was learning, was a messy thing that never stayed where you put it. From the kitchen, the faint, sweet smell of vanilla and sugar began to drift in, a ghost of happier times. His younger sister was trying. She was always trying. She stood at the worn wooden countertop, a dusting of flour on her cheek like a freckle. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she cracked an egg into a ceramic bowl. She was trying to bake a cake, her mother's special lemon cake. It was a ritual from her childhood, a recipe that could, on a good day, fix anything. A scraped knee, a broken heart, a bad day at school. The scent of it baking could chase away any shadow. But today, the shadows felt too big, too dark, to be scared off by a little cake. At the kitchen table, their mother sat. She was a beautiful woman, even now, with the same fine features as the woman in the photograph her son had just put away. But her eyes were distant, looking at something far beyond the kitchen walls, something only she could see. She was humming. It was a tune from a long-ago radio show, a melody that was both familiar and wrong, the notes slightly off-key, wandering like a lost child. Her daughter glanced over at her, her heart aching. "Remember this one, Mom?" she asked, her voice a little too bright, a little too full of cheer. "It's your lemon cake? Your favorite." The older woman stopped humming. She looked at the bag of flour on the counter, then at her daughter's face, a flicker of something recognition. Confusion? In her eyes. She reached out a thin, delicate hand and dipped a finger into the soft white powder, bringing it to her lips as if tasting it for the very first time. A small, childlike smile touched her lips, and then it was gone. The distant look returned, and she went back to humming her wandering tune. The sister turned back to her mixing bowl, her shoulders slumping just a fraction. She felt a hot sting behind her eyes and willed the tears not to fall. Crying wouldn't help. It would just be another thing to manage, another emotion to hide. She remembered being a little girl, standing on a stool to reach this same counter, her mother guiding her hands as she stirred the batter. "Feel that?" her mother would say. "That's the sound of a happy kitchen." But this kitchen wasn't happy. It was quiet, filled with the hum of the old refrigerator and the oppressive ticking of the wall clock. Each tick a reminder of the time that was slipping away. Thursday. That was the day they had circled on the calendar. The day the van would come to take her mother to a new home, a place with nurses and locked doors and other people who were forgetting their lives too. It was the right thing to do. Everyone said so. The doctors, the social worker, even her brother, in his quiet, logical way. But it felt like a betrayal. It felt like they were abandoning her, packing her away like one of the old things in the study. The older son appeared in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame. He looked at the mess of flour and sugar, at his sister's determined face, and at his mother lost in her own world. "How's it going in here?" he asked, his voice low. He always spoke softly now, as if a loud noise might shatter what was left of their fragile reality. "It's going," his sister replied, not turning around. "Making the cake." He nodded. He knew what she was doing. She was trying to bake a memory, hoping the smell and taste of it might bring their mother back to them, if only for a few minutes. He also knew it probably wouldn't work. He had seen these moments of clarity come and go like the sun breaking through clouds, brief and beautiful, but never lasting. "Dad's old war medals are in the bottom drawer," he said, changing the subject. "I found them. I don't know what to do with them." She finally stopped stirring and looked at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "Keep them," she said softly. "Just keep them." They stood there for a moment in the heavy silence, two children adrift in the ocean of their mother's illness. They were so different, he and his sister. He built walls of logic and practicality to protect himself. She built bridges of hope and memory, even when she knew they would lead nowhere. But in that moment, they were just a son and a daughter, missing their mother with a depth that felt bottomless. The sun outside began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, dark shadows across the floor. The day was ending, but the wait was far from over. The house was still holding its breath, waiting for a door to open, waiting for the moment when everything would change. The quiet in the house had settled into a heavy, rhythmless hum. The brother and sister sat at the kitchen table with their mother, a silent lunch of soup and sandwiches between them. The sister had tried to make conversation, pointing out a robin on the lawn outside, but her mother had just stared blankly, her spoon hovering halfway to her mouth. The brother had eaten his soup quickly, mechanically, as if it were just another task on a long list. The air was thick with the unsaid, with the shared knowledge that these simple, painful moments were numbered. They were just 2 days away from Thursday, the day that felt like an ending, and then it came. A sound that didn't belong. It was a sharp, metallic click from the front of the house, followed by the distinct, grating scrape of a key turning in a lock. It was a sound so out of place, so utterly wrong, that it seemed to stop time itself. The brother's hand froze halfway to his glass of water. The sister's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. They looked at each other, a silent, panicked question passing between them. No one was expected. No one ever just dropped by. Their lives had become too small, too guarded for that. The brother pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the linoleum floor, a harsh counterpoint to the silence that had just been broken. He walked out of the kitchen and down the short hallway, his steps slow and cautious, as if he were approaching a wild animal. His sister stood up, her napkin falling from her lap, and followed a few steps behind. Her heart hammering against her ribs, they reached the doorway of the living room just as the front door swung inward. Standing on the welcome mat, holding a small, worn-looking suitcase, was a man they hadn't seen in 15 years. It was their father? He looked smaller than they remembered, his shoulders slumped, his once dark hair now a shock of white. His face was a road map of lines and wrinkles, a life they knew nothing about etched into his skin. He was a ghost, a character from a story they had long ago closed and put away on a shelf. And yet, here he was, solid and real, standing in the beam of dusty light coming through the window. He looked at them, and his eyes, the same deep brown as his son's, were filled with a complicated mix of hesitation, shame, and a strange, desperate resolve. He opened his mouth, then closed it, as if the words were stuck in his throat, the silence stretched, thick and suffocating. It was the brother who finally broke it, his voice low and cold, laced with a decade and a half of frozen anger. "What are you doing here?" The father flinched at the tone, but he didn't look away. He took a small step inside, placing his suitcase gently on the floor as if it were made of glass. "I heard," he said, his voice rougher than they remembered, a little gravelly. "A friend of a friend. They told me about your mother. I had to come. I had to see her." His words hung in the air, an explanation that felt like no explanation at all. He had to see her. After all this time? After all the birthdays, the holidays, the quiet struggles, and the loud crises, he just decided he had to see her. The sister felt a hot surge of anger rise in her chest, fighting with a confusing, unwelcome flicker of something else. Pity? Curiosity? She couldn't tell. She just stared at the stranger who was her father, at the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, at the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "You can't just show up here," the brother said, his voice dangerously quiet. He was blocking the hallway, a human wall between his father and the rest of the house. "You don't get to do that." "Not now, I know," the father said, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know I don't have the right. But I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need a minute." The sister watched her brother's rigid back, the tension in his shoulders so tight it looked painful. She understood his anger. She felt it too. But looking at this old man, this fragment of their past, she also felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. The neat, painful narrative of their lives' abandoned father, struggling mother, resilient children had just been torn in half, ignoring his son. The father took another step, trying to peer past him into the kitchen. Is she okay?" That's when the sister moved. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the raw vulnerability in his voice, or maybe it was just the need to break the terrible stalemate. She gently touched her brother's arm. "Let him," she whispered. Her brother looked at her, his eyes full of fire, but after a long moment, he stepped aside. It was a small movement, but it felt like a monumental shift. The father walked slowly down the hall, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He paused in the kitchen doorway, looking at the woman sitting at the table. She had finished her soup and was now carefully tearing her napkin into tiny, neat squares, her focus entirely on the small task in her hands. She hadn't seemed to notice the commotion, the arrival of this man from her past. The brother and sister stood behind him, watching, feeling like intruders in their own kitchen. Their father approached the table cautiously, as if approaching a sleeping deer. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "Hello," he said softly. Their mother stopped tearing her napkin. She looked up, and for the first time that day, her eyes seemed to focus. She wasn't looking at her ex-husband, the man who had left her. The dementia had smoothed over the harsh edges of reality, replacing them with a softer, older version. She was looking at a young man with kind eyes, a man from a dance hall a lifetime ago. A faint, confused smile touched her lips. He looked at her, his own eyes filled with a deep, bottomless sadness. He reached a hand across the table, not quite touching hers. "It's me," he said, his voice barely a whisper, and in that moment something shifted in their mother's face. The confusion cleared, replaced by a flicker of sharp, painful lucidity. She saw him. But not as he was now. She saw him as he was then. Her lips parted and a single, clear word fell from them, a name that meant nothing to her children but everything to him. Anna, the name hung in the air, fragile and sharp. The father's face crumpled, the carefully constructed composure shattering in an instant. The brother and sister stared, their hearts pounding in unison. Anna? Who was Anna? The name was a key turning in a lock they never knew existed. The quiet waiting was over. The door had been opened, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. The name hung in the air between them, a single, sharp shard of glass in the thick silence of the kitchen. Anna. It was spoken so clearly, so precisely, by a woman who hadn't said a coherent sentence all day. For a breathtaking second, it felt like a miracle. Their mother was back. But the name was wrong. It was a stranger's name. The effect on their father was instantaneous and devastating. It was as if someone had pulled a hidden string, and all the strength, all the defiance he had walked in with, simply drained out of him. His face, which had been a mask of weary resolve, crumpled. The lines around his eyes and mouth deepened into canyons of pain. He made a small, choked sound like a man who has had the wind knocked out of him. He slumped forward in his chair, his elbows hitting the table with a dull thud, and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders began to shake, not with sobs, but with a deep, silent tremor that seemed to come from the very marrow of his bones. He was a man broken, shattered by a single word from the woman he had left behind. The brother and sister stood frozen, watching this raw, private agony. The brother's anger, which had been a hot, protective shield just moments before, now felt clumsy and out of place. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to throw the man out, to scream at him to get away from his mother, but he couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, a witness to a grief so profound it was terrifying. Their mother, having delivered her mysterious message, seemed to retreat once more. The clarity in her eyes clouded over. She looked down at the man weeping at her table with a mild, detached curiosity, as if he were a strange bird that had flown in through an open window. She picked up her napkin again and resumed tearing it into tiny squares. The name Anna, already forgotten, sinking back into the quiet depths of her mind. The sister was the first to move. She took a hesitant step forward, her heart aching for both of her parents, for the broken man and the woman who didn't know him. "What?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who is Anna?" The father didn't look up. He just shook his head, his hands still covering his face. The brother, finally finding his voice, stepped forward, his anger returning, but now it was laced with a desperate confusion. "Who is Anna?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. "What is this? What did you do?" The father slowly lifted his head. His face was a mess of tears and raw emotion. He looked at his son, his eyes pleading. We didn't, he stammered, the words catching in his throat. He looked from his son to his daughter, his gaze lost and broken. "It was a long time ago." "That's not an answer," the brother shot back, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "You show up here after 15 years, you say one word, and she breaks, and you just say it was a long time ago. Who is she?" The father opened his mouth to speak, but their mother, startled by the raised voices, let out a small, frightened whimper. She pushed her chair back from the table, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't understand the anger, the tension. She only knew it was loud and it was scary. The sister rushed to her side, putting a comforting arm around her shoulders. "It's okay, Mom," she soothed. "It's okay. We're just talking." The sight of their mother's fear was a bucket of cold water on the confrontation. The brother's anger deflated, replaced by a wave of guilt. He looked away, running a hand through his hair in frustration. The father watched them, his expression a mixture of gratitude and unbearable sadness. He knew he had caused this. He was the source of the poison that had just seeped into this fragile, already breaking family. "You should go," the brother said, his voice low and flat, turning his back on his father. He couldn't look at him anymore. The father nodded slowly. He seemed to shrink, to become even smaller. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his movements stiff and old. He looked at his ex-wife one last time, a look of such profound love and regret on his face that it made the sister's chest ache. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, down the hallway, and into the living room. They heard the soft thud of him sitting on the old sofa, and then nothing. The brother and sister were left alone with their mother, who was now humming her tuneless song again, the moment of fear already passing. The kitchen felt like a crime scene. The name Anna was still written on the walls, still echoing in the silence. The sister helped her mother back to her chair, then turned to her brother. "We have to know," she said. "Know what?" He replied, his voice bitter. "We know enough." "He's a coward who left?" "End of story." "No," she insisted, her voice firm. "It's not. Did you see his face? That wasn't the face of a man who just ran away. Something happened. Something with Anna." The brother didn't answer. He just stood there, staring out the window at the darkening sky. He wanted to believe it was that simple. He had spent 15 years building his life on the foundation of his father's betrayal. It was an ugly foundation, but it was solid. Now, it felt like the ground was turning to mud beneath his feet. That night, the house was filled with a new kind of tension. The father had not left. He was asleep on the living room couch, a silent, unmoving shape in the darkness. The brother and sister had agreed, reluctantly, to let him stay the night. There were no more answers to be had today. They were all too exhausted, too raw. Later, unable to sleep, the sister found herself in the attic. She was looking for old photographs, something cheerful to put in their mother's new room at the facility. A picture of her as a young woman, full of life, before the forgetting began. The attic was a place of ghosts, filled with the smell of old wood and dust. It was crammed with forgotten things, stacks of yellowed newspapers, lamps with frayed cords, and boxes upon boxes of memories. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on a small, sturdy-looking wooden box tucked away in a corner behind an old crib. It was different from the other boxes. It wasn't cardboard but dark wood, and it had a small, tarnished brass lock on it. It was the only thing up here that was locked. A chill went down her spine. She called for her brother. He came up the creaky stairs, his face etched with weariness. "What is it?" he asked. "This," she said, pointing the flashlight at the box. "It's locked? So?" "It's probably just old tax papers," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Then why lock it?" she countered. "And why hide it behind this?" He knew she was right. There was a finality to this, a sense that whatever was in this box was the end of something. With a sigh, he knelt beside her. He took a crowbar from a nearby tool bench and wedged it into the lid of the box. The wood groaned in protest. With a sharp, final crack, the lock snapped. The sound echoed in the quiet attic like a gunshot. The sister lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were bundles of letters tied with a brittle ribbon, and underneath them a single, official-looking document. She picked it up carefully. It was a birth certificate. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the names under mother and father. They were her parents' names. She read the date of birth. It was a year after her brother was born. And then she read the name at the top of the certificate. Anna. A baby girl. Anna. Her hands began to shake. She looked at her brother, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. He took the certificate from her, his brow furrowed in confusion. He read it once, then again. His face went pale. He looked from the paper to his sister, and the truth, the horrible, life-altering truth, settled in the space between them. They hadn't just been abandoned by their father. They had been left behind by parents who had lost another child. A sister they never knew they had, given away a lifetime ago. The anger, the betrayal, the simple story they had told themselves for 15 years, it all dissolved, replaced by a shared, devastating secret that had been hiding in a locked box in the attic, waiting for the door to be opened. The silence in the attic was a living thing. It was thick and heavy, pressing in on them from all sides, filled with the dust of 1,000 forgotten days. The brother and sister knelt on the cold floorboards, the single beam of the flashlight trembling in the sister's hand, illuminating the name that had just shattered their world. Anna. The birth certificate felt like a lead weight in the brother's hands. The official, typed letters a stark, brutal contrast to the swirling chaos in his mind. He read it again, his eyes scanning the names of his parents, the date, the name of the baby girl. It was real. It wasn't a mistake. His sister was the first to break the silence, her voice a choked whisper. "Anna," she said, the name feeling foreign and sacred on her tongue. "We had a sister." The words hung in the air, and with them came a wave of grief so sudden and so powerful it almost knocked her over. It wasn't just grief for a baby she never knew. It was grief for the lie she had lived her entire life. For the empty space at the dinner table she never knew was empty. For the shared secret that had poisoned her parents' marriage and cast a long, dark shadow over her childhood. The brother didn't speak. He just stared at the paper, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. His entire life he had built his understanding of his family on a single, simple fact. His father had left. He was the villain, the one who had walked away, leaving his mother to raise 2 children on her own. This fact had been the bedrock of his anger, the justification for his resentment, the foundation of his identity as the protective son. And now, in the space of a single minute, that bedrock had turned to dust. His father hadn't just left his mother. He had left after a loss so great, so unspeakable, that they had buried it in a locked box in the attic and never spoken its name again. Slowly, carefully, the brother placed the birth certificate back in the box, as if it were a sacred relic. He closed the lid, the soft click echoing in the stillness. He stood up, his movements stiff like an old man. He didn't look at his sister. He just turned and walked toward the attic stairs, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. She followed, the flashlight now off, plunging them back into the dim, gray light filtering through the small dusty window. Descending the stairs felt like leaving one world and entering another. The house they had grown up in, the house that had felt so familiar just an hour ago, now felt like a stranger. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the hallway, seemed to hold a piece of the terrible new truth. They found their mother in her bedroom, sitting in her favorite armchair by the window, looking out at the garden. She was humming again, that same wandering, tuneless melody. For a moment, they just stood in the doorway, watching her. How could they ask her? How could they possibly open this wound, a wound that had clearly never healed, in a mind that was already so fragile? The sister took a deep breath and walked into the room, her brother a silent, brooding presence behind her. She knelt beside her mother's chair, taking her soft, wrinkled hand in her own. "Mom," she said softly, her voice gentle, "we need to ask you something." Their mother turned her head slowly, her eyes distant. She looked at her daughter, then at her son standing behind her, a flicker of recognition in her gaze. She smiled a faint, sleepy smile. The brother stepped forward. He couldn't do gentle. He was too raw, too full of the shattered pieces of his past. He held out the birth certificate. "What is this?" he asked, his voice rough, not with anger but with a deep, searing pain. Their mother looked at the paper, her brow furrowed in concentration. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the edge of the certificate. For a long moment, she said nothing. The sister held her breath, praying for a sign, for anything. And then it happened. The distant look in her mother's eyes cleared, replaced by a deep, bottomless sadness that was terrifying in its clarity. It was as if a window had been flung open in her mind, and for a brief, shattering moment she was fully present. "Anna," she whispered, the name a breath of air. She looked from the paper to her children, her eyes filling with tears. She was so little, so beautiful. Her voice was thin, fragile, like old paper. It hurt too much. The world was so quiet after she was gone. It hurt to look at him. It hurt to look at you. Her gaze fell on her son. You had his eyes. Every time I looked at you, I saw him and I remembered. And it hurt too much. The words were a confession, an explanation, and an apology all at once. The brother felt his knees go weak. All these years he had thought his mother's sadness was about the divorce. He never knew it was about something so much deeper. He wasn't a reminder of a failed marriage. He was a living, breathing reminder of a lost child. Just as quickly as it came, the clarity was gone. Their mother's eyes clouded over again. She looked at the paper in her son's hand with mild confusion, then patted his hand. "That's a nice paper," she said, her voice vague and distant. She turned back to the window and resumed her humming. The terrible moment of lucidity already sinking back beneath the surface, the brother and sister left the room, closing the door softly behind them. The truth was out, but it didn't feel like a relief. It felt like a wound had been opened, and it was bleeding all over the house. They found their father in the living room. He was sitting on the edge of the sofa, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. He looked up as they entered, and there was no surprise in his eyes. He had been waiting for this. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this moment for 15 years. The brother didn't say anything. He just walked over to the coffee table and placed the birth certificate on it, the paper stark white against the dark wood. He pointed a finger at it. "Tell us," he said, his voice low and steady. "Tell us everything." Their father looked at the paper, then at his children. His face was a mask of anguish. "I wanted to tell you," he said, his voice cracking. "So many times. But how do you start a story like that? How do you tell your children that their family was built on a grave?" He told them then. He told them about the baby, the joy, and then the sickness, the tiny, perfect baby who was too fragile for the world. He told them about the silence that fell over their house after she was gone, a silence so loud it was deafening. He told them about their mother's grief, a grief so profound it had swallowed her whole. And he told them about his own. "We couldn't comfort each other," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. Looking at her was like looking in a mirror. We were just two people drowning in the same ocean, and we were pulling each other down. I had to leave. Not because I didn't love her. Not because I didn't love you. I left because I was afraid I would drown us all. The sister was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her face. She understood. She finally understood. It wasn't a story of abandonment. It was a story of survival. A story of two people who loved each other so much and were so broken that the only way they could survive was to be apart. The brother stood there, his anger completely gone, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness. All the years of bitterness, of righteous indignation had evaporated, leaving behind a profound and aching sadness for his parents, for the sister he never knew, and for the little boy he used to be, who had grown up carrying a burden that was never his to bear. He sank onto the sofa opposite his father, the anger in his shoulders finally releasing. Leaving him feeling tired and small, the three of them sat there in the quiet living room as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the floor. The confrontation was over. The truths had collided and the wreckage was all around them. But for the first time in 15 years, they were sitting in the wreckage together. And in the heavy silence, there was the faintest hint of something new. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But understanding. And that, they knew, was a place to start. The sun came up on Wednesday, but it didn't feel like a new day. It felt like the same old day, just with more truth in it. The light that filtered through the lace curtains seemed to carry the weight of the confessions from the night before, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the heavy silence. The house was no longer just waiting for Thursday. It was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen now that all the secrets were out. The brother was the first one awake. He came downstairs to find his father already in the kitchen, not as an intruder, but as if he belonged there. The older man was standing by the counter, slowly, methodically making a pot of coffee. The familiar gurgle of the coffee maker, a sound the brother had heard 1,000 times, now sounded completely different. It was the sound of a morning routine, a small domestic act that felt monumental. His father hadn't made coffee in this kitchen in 15 years. The older man turned, holding up a mug in a silent question. The brother nodded. His father poured a second cup and slid it across the counter. They stood there in silence, two men separated by a chasm of time, connected by the simple, bitter warmth of the coffee. There was no anger left in the brother. It had been burned out of him, replaced by a vast, hollow ache. He looked at his father, at the white hair and the tired eyes, and saw not a villain, but a man who had been carrying his own terrible burden for a lifetime. The sister came down a little while later. She stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, her brother and her father sharing a quiet morning coffee. It was a picture she had never in her wildest imagination thought she would see. A small, fragile smile touched her lips. She walked over and poured herself a cup, joining them at the counter. No one spoke. They didn't need to. They were all just floating in the same sea of grief, and for now, just knowing the others where there was enough. The day passed in a strange, dreamlike haze. The original plan was still in motion. Tomorrow was the move. But now, packing the final boxes felt different. It was no longer just a chore, a sad task of closing down a life. It was an archaeological dig. Every item they touched was an artifact from a life they thought they knew, now seen through a new, heartbreaking lens. The father helped. He worked quietly, efficiently, wrapping delicate glassware in old newspaper and taping up boxes with a steady hand. He handled their mother's things with a gentle reverence that made his children's hearts ache. He was touching memories he had been shut out of for 15 years, and with each item he seemed to be saying a silent goodbye. That night, they ate a simple meal of pizza, sitting on the floor in the middle of the living room, surrounded by stacks of boxes. It was awkward and strange, but it was also strangely normal. They talked about small things, the brother's job, the sister's new apartment, the father's quiet life in a small town a few hundred miles away. They were carefully circling the giant, invisible elephant in the room, testing the waters of this new, fragile relationship. For the first time, they weren't just a mother, a son, and a daughter bound by duty and resentment. They were a family bound by a shared, devastating secret. Thursday arrived, bright and clear. The moving van pulled up in the morning, and the quiet of the house was shattered by the noise of strangers carrying boxes and furniture out the door. The three of them stood on the lawn, watching as their childhood home was emptied, piece by piece. Their mother, surprisingly calm amidst the chaos, sat in a garden chair, holding a single, wilting flower from her garden. She looked at the bustling activity with a mild, detached interest. As if she were watching a play, the drive to the assisted living facility was quiet. The brother drove, his sister in the passenger seat, and their father in the back. They didn't play the radio. They just drove, the silence in the car no longer heavy or oppressive, but companionable. They were a unit, a small, sad convoy on their way to a difficult destination. Getting their mother settled in her new room was the hardest part. It was a small, clean space with a single bed, a window, and a small bathroom. It was nothing like the home she had lived in for over 40 years. But they worked together to make it feel like her own. The sister hung a few of her mother's favorite paintings on the walls. The brother set up her small television and radio. Their father carefully placed the wilting flower from the garden in a glass of water on her bedside table. Their mother watched them, her eyes moving from one to the other. She didn't say anything, but as they worked, a small, peaceful smile spread across her face. Maybe she didn't understand where she was or why her children and the man who looked so familiar were all there. But in that moment, she was surrounded by her family, and she was content once she was settled. The three of them stood by the large window in her room, looking out at the manicured grounds of the facility. An orderly was pushing a resident in a wheelchair down the path. Birds were chirping in the trees. It was a peaceful, ordinary scene. But for them, it was the end of one life and the beginning of another. The brother broke the silence. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out the folded birth certificate. He had carried it with him all day. He looked at the name Anna, then looked at his father, and then at his sister. His voice was quiet, but it was filled with a new, steady resolve. "We should find her," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A promise. Their father looked at his son, his eyes filling with tears. He nodded, unable to speak. The sister reached out and put a hand on her brother's arm, then on her father's. She looked at the birth certificate, at the name of the sister she never knew. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of hope. The door had opened early, letting in a ghost and a truth that had shattered their world. But as they stood there, the three of them, looking out at the future, they knew that nothing would ever be the same. The story of their family was not over. It had just been given a new, unexpected, and difficult second chapter. And together they were ready to turn the page.